Good morning, everybody. Let me also thank Samir Huiktap for the opportunity to be here today, just in advance of COP28, a couple of months after the G20. I think at a very critical point in global affairs, unfortunately. I think this is a great opportunity to bring together the G20 and the COP processes. I think it's something that should be continued. And let me also congratulate ORF Middle East for launching this evening. The empire is growing, Samir. So this first panel today really tackles one of the most critical issues, I think, for developing countries, and one that has become, I think, even more important in the context of the last 2 years and the developments of the last 2 years. The Green Development Imperative. And I want to start by making 3 observations before I ask my panel to weigh in with their expertise. The first, I think, is that development and climate, or dealing with climate change, are not mutually exclusive. And I think that is absolutely important to recognize. The second point is that while in some parts of the world we are talking about the need to reduce energy consumption, in most of the developing world, energy poverty is still persistent. So I come from South Africa. South Africa itself at the moment is tackling its own energy challenges. But at least we have power, much more than the rest of the continent. There are over 600 million people in Africa who do not have access to energy. And yet the continent has the potential to supply 40% of renewable energy. That's 40% of the world's renewable energy resources. It also has a significant number of critical minerals necessary for green technology. And that was also something that was pointed out a little earlier. It has also made some significant gas discoveries in the last few years. So what does that mean in the context of the energy transition? And the third observation I want to make is that inequality, which in the Southern African region in particular, but in other parts of Africa and other parts of the developing world, is a significant problem, will only grow if the structural global challenges related to the energy transition are not addressed. So with those remarks, let me kick off first with Ambassador Chenoy, who has a broad remit in terms of the work he focuses on, and of course also being chair of the Think 20 core group this year. Ambassador Chenoy, perhaps you can just provide us, by way of kickoff, a little bit of a sense of the global context in which these developments around energy are taking place. And also then I'd like you to focus specifically on India's green hydrogen journey, which I think is something that a number of developing countries are embarking on, not least my own, South Africa, Namibia, and so on. Perhaps you can reflect a little bit on that too. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth, and my grateful thanks to Dr. Ebtisam and Dr. Samir Saran for having me here. It's a great pleasure to see old friends from our Think 20 events held in India and overseas. Let me begin by simply endorsing what you said. There's a very close link between energy, climate, and growth. And now that we've had a very successful New Delhi Leaders' Declaration during India's G20 presidency, it's also time to evaluate what went into that declaration and then walk the talk. So there is a direct link between the G20 outcomes and COP28, and I do hope that we'll be able to get there. As far as India is concerned, we've always emphasized the linkages between energy and development. And Prime Minister Modi in particular has been taking a number of initiatives. You know that India made certain nationally determined commitments at the COP21 in Paris in 2015, and later actually improved upon these at COP26. This was called the Panchamrit, the five ambrosia or five nectars policy. The whole idea was to get to roughly 500 gigawatts of our energy coming from non-fossil fuel. But there are other initiatives also taken in the context of the International Solar Alliance, the One Sun, One World, One Grid concept. That's the Green Grids initiative. More particularly, Prime Minister Modi's Lifestyles for Sustainable Development, known as LIFE, which found clear mention, as you know, in the G20 statement as well. And India has been doing a great deal with regard to vehicular pollution also. We've tried to move through the faster adoption and manufacturing of hybrid and electric vehicles, known as FAME2, to try and change our own matrix of energy. Having said that, let me say that there was broad agreement in Paris on combating climate change, and since then big changes have taken place. The whole problem is that there is a weakened multilateralism today. And G20, India's presidency stands out for actually bringing people together in the same room and forging a certain kind of consensus, especially with regard to the Green Development Pact, and the importance of linking climate action with the achievement of the all-important Sustainable Development Goals of the UN 2030 agenda. So this is something that we have to focus on, especially the availability or non-availability of technology, availability or non-availability, more particularly of finance, hybrid finance at that, and the need to innovate and to share innovations with the global south. Now, we have seen that there have been technological advancements in the last 10 years or so, but these have not necessarily percolated down to economies of the global south. The top three emitters are essentially China, the US, and India. They account for 42.6% of total emissions. But of these, India has the lowest per capita emissions. You are aware of that. Roughly 1/3 of the global average. In fact, the lowest among the top 10 emitters of greenhouse gases. And even with 1.4 billion people, an economy that is now the 5th largest in the world, soon to be the 3rd largest in the next 5 years, growing at roughly 7%, India has actually got very low per capita emissions. And our historical contribution has also been very low. So this is the backdrop from which I think we should look at India's initiative with regard to green hydrogen. We want to become the hub of green hydrogen. We are on a resolute march towards achieving that. At COP26, Prime Minister Modi committed to a number of things. Earlier this year, you're aware that in January 2023, India allocated US $2.5 billion for its national green hydrogen mission. By 2030, we are likely to have the capacity of 5 million metric tons per annum, which can provide renewable energy addition of about 125 gigawatts to our matrix. The current global demand for hydrogen is growing. It's about 70 million metric tons. But the irony is that 76% of this is being produced from natural gas, which is again fossil, and 23% from coal, again fossil fuel. Only 1% comes from electrolysis of water. So the key challenge before us today when we look at green hydrogen, whether in India or anywhere else, is in fact the cost. The cost of green hydrogen is much higher as compared to grey hydrogen or anything else for that matter. And greater emphasis, in my view, is required in order to create the right kind of infrastructure for producing green hydrogen, especially in electrolyzers. Unless this is done, I think it will be impossible to actually make green hydrogen competitive. or competitive enough. The market in India for green hydrogen, cumulative value in India could be about $8 billion by 2030 and $340 billion by 2050. So I think I'll just stop on that note that concessional funding is required. The PPP model is relevant to furthering the objectives of green hydrogen, whether in India or elsewhere. Sharing of technology among multiple stakeholders. Unless we do that, unless there is an equitable green transition towards notably green hydrogen, we are not going to be able to ensure the achievement of the climate action goals and objectives, certainly not in time. And the net zero objectives will also be that much more difficult to achieve. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Ambassador. I think you've highlighted a couple of issues related to the challenges, but one of the things that is very important is not only about technology transfers, but I think the point that global South countries can also be drivers of technology development and innovation, and are themselves actually moving forward in that. So it's not just about being takers, but also leaders. And of course, the recognition that while today the three largest emitters may very well be China, the US, and India, the carbon stock is not entirely the responsibility of India or China at the moment. And I think that speaks to the historical, the common but differentiated responsibilities. Let me move on to you, Tina, my neighbor across the Indian Ocean in Mauritius. Mauritius, of course, is a small island developing state. The challenge and the vulnerabilities of small island developing states very much recognized, I think, increasingly in the global narrative around climate change. I think Mauritius, of course, also, I think, depends to some extent on coal as well. I think we're all in the same boat in that regard. Perhaps you can reflect a little bit on some of the specific challenges and some of the initiatives within Mauritius on issues of energy and growth.
Thank you, Elizabeth. First of all, my greetings to all the panelists right now and all the delegates who have joined us this morning, and happy Diwali. And it is a huge honor and privilege to be able to be part of this panel this morning, as I said, on Diwali, to be able to make a contribution to try to at least leave this world better than we found it, and to leave to generations yet unborn with the hope, and I truly hope that we are able to at least make it, of having this world with zero carbon print. So before coming to the hurdles, I would like to say that I believe that we are assembled today, not merely as delegates, but as architects of a future that transcends borders and encompasses the collective destiny of humanity, with this very firm resolve to transform the current dystopian view of a planet we are now facing into what I would like to call a pragmatic and realizable utopia. So this nexus between the G20 and the COP28 encapsulates, for me, not just economic strategies, but a profound covenant with the very sustenance of our planet, a covenant that binds the imperatives of energy, climate, and growth. And the G20, historically the vanguard of economic fortitude, must now emerge as the vanguard of environmental stewardship, just like the ambassador just mentioned. So as we stand at the cusp of a dangerous climate quagmire, the traditional tenets of economic growth urgently warrant a radical recalibration. So COP28 beckons us with a summon to transform growth from a mere economic metric into a testament of our commitment to ecological harmony. And indeed, Elizabeth, as you said, for small island developing states like Mauritius, so we have been struggling with so many challenges. So from coastal erosion to even climate financing. So I truly believe that today, this dialogue in this room should not be confined to this conference room. And as it reverberates across continents and resonates in the hearts and minds of people around the world, I would like to make this plea. Just like you said, the complexities inherent in this very endeavor require a collaborative approach. And hence, first of all, we have a financial imperative, which is actually one of the most, I would say, main obstacles faced by developing economies and small island developing states. So like, for instance, last week we were in New Delhi for the Energy Transition Dialogue, and I actually made that in the plea as well, that these compounding challenges, like especially for the South, like especially for the SIDS and for Mauritius, they heighten our inherent vulnerabilities and imperil our sustainable development objectives, and verily our even, we don't even know whether we will still exist in some years to come if we are flooded. And just like the Maldives, we are actually very, very vulnerable. So I make this plea to all the developing nations, the developed countries, all the agencies here, the authorities here in this room present today, to at least come together so that we can find the solution. I think I don't have to go back to the past where I have to say it as it is, where developed countries have failed to deliver on the promises which were made more than 14 years ago, from the Doha to the COP, to the Kyoto. So all these promises on climate financing, which were not and have not been respected until today. So, for instance, for Mauritius, to be able to ensure the successful implementation of our program to achieve that sustainability and to survive, we will need, for instance, a total of around $6 billion US. And we are trying to commit maximum funds to this, but we do urge and make a plea to financial institutions to recognize that GDP or GNI per capita is not the sole measure of a country's development. And hence, we call on that the international financial institutions and development partners use what we call the multidimensional vulnerability index developed by the United Nations as a tool for further integrating SIDS vulnerability into the decision-making. And this is a proven tool and tested by the UN. Hence, in this way, SIDS will need adequate and predictable support, including this climate financing from the international community. So I again call on our partners to help us to make this easier for SIDS. So I would also like to say that, hurdles come in a lot of ways, not just in terms of financing. So, for instance, be it policy coherence, or even in terms of collaboration, we have a lot of challenges. So we may need to look into this, or maybe I should stop here and continue later. Thank you.
No, thanks very much, Tina. I think I like your point about the importance of the G20 as a steward of the environment, not just of global economic governance. And I think the issue here of beyond GDP, the multidimensional vulnerability index, absolutely. Vulnerability is measured in many ways, and it has nothing to, most of them don't have much to do with per capita, indicators, and of course policy coherence, not within countries also, but the way in which the developed world, I think, executes both the Sustainable Development Goals and their climate commitments, I think is very important. Let me move on to Riatu, and Riatu, I want to ask you specifically, I think, well, Indonesia, of course, chaired the G20. I think the developmental issues of energy poverty were very much on the agenda. But also, Indonesia has walked a path similar to South Africa in terms of its international cooperation, international partnerships around the just energy transition. And perhaps you can reflect a little bit on that as a way in which developing countries, particularly ones that are highly coal dependent, can move forward.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, RF, and also Emirates Policy Centers. It's actually interesting, and I think it's very successful and good progress for G20, India, and also UAE for cooperation of G28. And that in that context, I think following up also from Indonesia, I think commitment of the government of Indonesia also driving from we hosting the G20 and focusing on the just energy transitions, and also in terms of financings. Emphasizing as well that emerging countries, of course, we are much focusing on economic growth, but embedded on the environmental aspect in it. And this, in terms of energy transition, it needs to be inclusive, and actually can also be incorporating endowment that are available in the countries. So, for example, in the context of ASEAN countries, we are still, of course, on renewable energy is still on 30%. We are on coal-based energy, especially in the case of Indonesia. So it might be that path of transitioning might be different across regions, across countries. Therefore, it needs a good, credible monitoring and policy evaluations in terms of to make a progress is much faster, and accountability not only on the case of the government level, but accountability of the with other stakeholders as well. So emerging countries will still be the energy demand will improve, will increase, but this should be in the path that improving also environment and ecosystem of renewable energy to expand as well. So in that context, policies, balancing policies that subsidizing the context of fuel and non-green energy, so the level of playing field is quite the same with the renewable energy, and the context of transfer of technology not only between developed and developing countries, cooperation, I think is more important among developing countries, given we might learn on the imperfect institutional setting, and we might learn what could be work and not could be work. And it's not even in the level of just national level, but also at the cities level, for example. Given, I think on the emissions, cities is the center of economic growth, and it's also, I think, emits mostly like 60% to 70% of emissions, and they have also the resource capacity that can also be enhanced and can be piloted in complement to the context of country-by-country cooperations or multilateral setting. Yeah.
Thanks, Riatu. I'm going to come back on a couple of the points that you raised, but let me go through the first round first. Renata, over to you. Brazil is, of course, taking over from India in a couple of weeks as G20 president. A couple of years, you will also be chairing COP30. and driving that agenda. I think Brazil, unlike some of our countries here, I think has a much more balanced energy mix, a much more sustainable energy mix. Perhaps you can reflect a little bit also from sitting where you are in Latin America on some of the challenges and some of the ways forward.
Well, let me start by thanking the organizers for inviting me for this very timely and important discussion. You started by saying that the relationship between energy and development pass by assuring that most people have access to energy. Why so? Because modern life is energy intensive, and there is a positive correlation between demographic growth and per capita income and energy use. Now, having said that, what is worrying is that right now, not less than 85% of green energy, clean energy for that matter, new projects take place in industrial countries and China. And why is it so? Lack of resources. Money matters. And we are talking about trillions of dollars to change the whole process of energy generation and the grid of energy transmission. And that brings to an agenda that I think I would propose that we have 4 items in a basic agenda. The first and foremost is, of course, to try and solve the financial issue. We have, of course, and this is bound to be a central issue, I guess, in the COP28, the commitment by rich countries to provide resources in substantive amounts on a yearly basis. So far, it's less than 20% or about 20% what we see. And this is a very sensitive issue because a good deal of those rich countries are putting money in a few wars that we have here and there right now. And this is a very sensitive issue. And as a matter of fact, the demand should be to increase that commitment more than anything else. Now, issuing new money or government bonds and so on and so forth is definitely not sufficient. You have to bring the private sector in. So you have to identify good, appealing projects to try and be it PPP, as an ambassador has mentioned, or whatever. This is a sensitive issue, and it's not a question of going for good projects or good intentions. We had recently the experience of Ecuador. Ecuador had voting to not exploit oil in some sensitive areas. As it turns out, the rating agency Fitch reduced the country rating. Why so? Because a good deal of the government revenue is related to oil tax. So what would look like a very positive step, as a matter of fact, it turned out with a very high cost. Now, financing is the first point, and perhaps the most binding constraint. The second point is the government action. Nothing happens without proactive government initiatives to try and show the way to do. What are we going to do from now on in terms of designing middle to long-term development trajectory? The third dimension is, for lack of a better name, social/cultural dimension. Meaning for that, the need to, quote-unquote, educate consumers and producers in the direction of better use of resources, changing traditional patterns of behavior, opting out for energy saver electrical domestic appliances, and so on and so forth. And the fourth dimension, and I think that might come out in COP, is the lack of some kind of global universal set of disciplines, or maybe ideally some universal multilateral agency, to try and discipline unilateral measures that have been adopted by a number of countries in terms of, be it protectionist measures, disguised as good climate-friendly, environment-friendly measures, or the adoption or requirement for productive standards. Both of them distort competitive advantage and affect directly, for instance, a region like myself in Latin America, which has an enormous potential to be in the forefront of the new green productive schedule. So some kind of global discipline is very much in need. And this is an issue, it's not a minor issue. So I think we can think in terms of the 4 dimensions of agenda to deal with climate. Now, I don't want to monopolize, but just as a footnote, coming back to your provocation with regard to Brazil and COP28, the issues of deforestation, efficient agricultural production, inclusive energy transition are bound to be ranking high in the agenda. It goes without saying. I mean, no in Brazil and its competitive advantage and recent story. I mean, that's to be expected that these are going to be high in the agenda in COP28. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Renato. Last but not least, and I'm gonna move quickly now because I'm also very mindful of the clock that's looming large. Swarnam, Nepal, also a critically important, certainly in that part of the world, hydro resources and so on, but also a least developed country. Yeah. Again, with particular finance, if not anything else, challenges.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yes, so I come from Nepal, which sees itself as the custodian of the Central Himalayas, 8 of the 10 highest mountains in the world, including Everest. And the glaciers that flow from those Himalayas feed rivers that can generate up to 100,000 megawatts of clean electricity, which can power all our domestic needs, but also help displace dirty sources of fuel in fast-growing India and Bangladesh, right? So yet, because of climate change, which we've not contributed to at all, we are bearing the brunt because those very glaciers are melting, are receding. There are some dire predictions from international organizations like ICIMOD. So our mantra in Nepal has been, well, all net zero paths are led through clean electricity, right? So as a columnist in the New York Times put it memorably, you make electricity clean, you make much more clean electricity, and you make almost everything run on electricity. So that's the solution, part of the solution that we offer, not just to our own country, but the entire region and possibly the globe. Now, per capita income-wise, we're the second poorest on the continent. And yet the paradox is more than 90% of our people already, way ahead of the SDG deadlines, have access to electricity, but these are basic appliances and lighting. Now, what we need to do is, all the cooking installations should be electric, and eventually, of course, the transport fleet, and then the industrial. Then we increase the consumption of clean electricity. But there are 3 hurdles. First is finance, as has been highlighted. Second is technology. And third, which has not been mentioned so far, are the geopolitical imperatives as well. Nepal, very strategically located between China and India. So as India-China rivalry heats up, as US-China rivalry heats up, this very resource is also caught somewhere in between. I don't have time to go into detail, but let me just mention that the finance would impact how we develop simultaneously all the components of the energy value chain, right? So it's not just producing, but distributing, storing, and using that clean electricity usefully. So we don't have the money yet, and this is where we need to pair both technology and finance, with de-risking and depoliticizing as well. Geographically very hostile. There are parts of the country where, so-called last mile connectivity challenges. So that would demand a distributed generation at the municipal level. So because we can't extend the national grid to every single settlement, again, finance and technology would come into the picture. And the third is the very Himalayas, the geology of production requires us to trade electricity in a very amiable, constructive, through possibly a regional grid with India and Bangladesh and the rest of South Asia. There's let me just give you an example of how we complement. India's peak demand for electricity in November starts at 7 o'clock and lasts for 1 hour. And in the summer, it starts at about 8 o'clock and lasts till midnight, right? So we have the ability to even that out, Nepal, right? And and the aggressive manner with which India is sort of expanding its renewable capacity still needs a flexible generation like hydropower, which can stabilize its demand for peak power, right? So there's a lot of complementarity for regional trade, but a lot of the folks who are interested in developing Nepal's hydro competitively are often the Chinese. India has a particular attitude towards procuring electricity that have been produced with Chinese talent or money or technology. And at the same time, the United States also, through the MCC and other initiatives, coming quite aggressively into Asia, yet there are geopolitical aspects to how we navigate that.
Thanks, Sonia. That's a very important, I think, point. The geopolitics of it, the geotechnology of it. I think it's increasingly, the race is on for whoever controls the technology and is the first mover is the one who will have the geopolitical advantage. We are running out of time. What I want to do is a very quick, rapid, sort of around it's not quite the table, it's not a tour de table, but a very rapid response from each of you about perhaps the one thing that you would like to see coming out of COP28 or COP29, because we know these are processes, and perhaps the one thing that we can do regionally as well, perhaps, in terms of dealing with the green development imperative. Because I think you've made a very important point about the importance of regional cooperation. Clearly there needs to be global, but also regional. Who wants to go first? Ambassador Chenoy.
Thank you very much. I have two quick points to make. One is that the Global Biofuel Alliance that came out of the G20 declaration in Delhi must be greatly welcomed. But the point is that there are 3 countries leading the charge of the Light Brigade here. That's India, the United States, and Brazil, now supported by 12 countries and 19 international organizations. But mind you, all the main producers of fossil fuels have not yet signed on to the Global Biofuels Alliance. So I hope something comes out on that score. The other point here is that I'd like to see this not only go into blending, ethanol being used for blending, as we are in India now doing 20% blending by 2025 of all our petrol and fuel that we'll use. In aviation fuel, I think there's great scope to do much more, beginning perhaps with 1% or as little as that. But may I also suggest that there should be a new kind of carbon tax or an examination of how war machines pollute and whether we ever study what a tank does or an aircraft does when there is a raging war in Ukraine or in the Middle East. Do we ever speak of green transitions there as well? Can you fight a war with green fuel, please, for God's sake, if you can't stop the wars? So that's something. And coal, I think, is also very important. I hope at COP28, some allowance is made for the continuation of coal, because coal is going to be around for a long time. It's the cheapest. And let me tell you that the capacity utilization in renewable energy projects is 1/3 that of thermal. So it's not just India that will have to, with its large reserves of coal and large requirements, continue to use coal alongside the emphasis on green transition, but also countries like Germany and many others are doing just that. So let's also face reality, accept reality, and try and achieve a balance between what is doable, what is feasible, what is desirable. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Tina. It comes on after you.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think the question here is not just about recognizing the inherent challenges, but as I said earlier, it's the reason why we are in this room is to be able to mobilize this robust international support together and to be able to direct substantial resources towards solutions that will seamlessly integrate energy access with sustainability. So I believe that comprehensive planning is the right compass, which will guide us through this labyrinth of SDGs, and also developing strategies that will seamlessly integrate multiple goals. I believe that while aligning our global goals, which are the SDGs, there is no one size fits all. So, of course, there are global objectives, but we also have to contextualize, because everything, like I said, for SIDS, it may be different. Vulnerabilities are different. There are inherent specificities. So we have to bear this in mind in our planning. So our actions must be, I said that earlier, like symphonies, where we can have each note resonating with others to create that kind of harmonious progress. So hence, I believe, especially coming from SIDS, that one urgent thing we really need is maybe to be able to establish a transformative fund which can be dedicated to sustainable energy solution. This can be characterized by innovation in financing, and it should transcend traditional aid models and encourage partnerships that drive sustainable development goals. I also believe that capacity building is of essence, because you mentioned technology earlier, just like our friend from Nepal was talking. So I believe that technology transfer is also important, and education. So starting from not just formal education, but even like sensitization, even from the kids at home to schools about the need, you know, to take care of environment and keeping Mother Earth, treating Mother Earth with due respect. All these are so important. And last but not the least, as you said, COP28 or COP29, I do not agree, because it's too much of lip service for years and years now. So we cannot say, if not COP28, then COP29. No, we're here because we are here to take this firm commitment. So let this COP28 be that watershed moment where this unilateral commitment comes through, and we all, from the commitment, the actions drive through. And at least those actions start. Then it can lead to something else, to COP29. But no more lip service. Thank you.
No, absolutely. You can't be more right on that. I think the commitments have to come. Certainly they can't be flowing in one direction. Riatu, very quickly.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this need to continue of the green transition, addressing the challenges, and also in the context of the monitoring and evaluation, as mentioned also, the needs of capacity of emerging countries and developing countries learning together, and stock taking, what actually to encompass the challenge, given that when we are passing out the coal and then giving subsidies or incentive to the renewable, we're not doing the same mistake of in terms of the governance of, or in terms of other unintended impacts. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks. Short and sharp.
Well, being consistent with what I just said, the main constraint is financing. One, you have to find ways of assuring resources for this transition. Two, cooperation in terms of international discipline. And three, cooperation in terms of best practices in adapting consumption and production standards. That's it.
And financing, paired with de-risking and depoliticization, treat them as global public goods, almost in the textbook sense of being non-rivalrous and non-excludable. Work to reduce country risk premia. The current lending architecture penalizes poor countries where the need is possibly the highest. So let's de-risk, and I want all the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, to really work on this, and massive reform and overhaul, including the IFC, to make sure that investments are de-risked.
That's great, thanks. I see we're right on time, but Promit, are you saying we can take 2 questions? Excellent, we can take 2 questions. So just put your hands up, the 2 questions. There was one there, and there was the lady, the blonde lady there, yes. Okay.
Hi, thank you. My name is Mariana Buquerque, I'm from Brazil, and my question is directly to Renato. We know a little bit about what Brazilian intentions are to the G20 presidency, so we have announced task forces and priorities and pillars, but not that much about the reforms of IFIs. And then connected to your question, where do you think the Brazilian presidency should go to reform the multilateral financial institutions that could bridge the gap between needs and the money that we have flowing now?
Okay, let's take both questions and then we'll revert to the panel.
Hello, I'm Mornila Tucci. I'm coming from Albania, a small country in Balkans, South Europe. So my question is, you are talking about global finance and that we all developing countries, we need support from the polluters, let's say. But my question is, what your countries are doing? What are your budgets in your governments about the climate issues and climate change issues?
Okay, right. Thank you. Let's start with Renato, and then we'll go around if you have the numbers in your head or can provide some examples. Yeah.
Of course, Brazil is just one of hundreds of country members in the international institutions. What the Brazilian diplomacy can do is, and is doing, is to try and convince the highest number of partners to try and influence the behavior of those institutions. Just last week, I've seen in the TV an interview with the president of IADB, which is also Brazilian, Ilan Goldfein. And he was stressing very much one aspect that I think is to be taken into account. The very fact that all projects to be financed by the IADB have, before they are approved, they have to prove the environmental impact, the social impact, and of course, influence on climate and so on and so forth. So if that's true for the IADB, that can also be a good practice to be adopted by the World Bank or Asian Bank or NDB and so on and so forth. So if that's true, then you presumably have a good example. So I don't know whether I have answered your question, but this is what can be done and should be done.
I think there are lots of good proposals on the table for scaling up finance. I think the issue always, the big challenge is the political will to actually implement things, and also not to use, which is sometimes the case, excuses of articles of association telling us to do this or that. These can be changed. These can be changed.
If I may add a footnote, it's very important to keep in mind what Ambassador Chenoy has stressed. Coal and oil are not going to disappear. Oil is used not only for energy, it's used with multiple uses. So it's not a matter of thinking in day one and day two, rid of oil or rid of coal. There are a number of uses for those products apart from energy. So the adaptation process has to be well thought, has to be agreed upon, and it's definitely something that won't happen in 24 hours.
Yeah. What I'll do now is I'll start with you and then move this way, just very quickly. Yeah.
Poor country by definition doesn't have much money, so dedicated to climate, there's very little. But one thing I'm quite proud of in my own country is we tax fossil fuel dependent vehicles of punitive tariff rate of almost 250%. It was purely born out of revenue needs for the country, but now it can be dovetailed into a genuine carbon tax. But given the fungibility of public finance, you can't really then channel it to fight climate change. It's used to meet civil servant salaries. But I wish there's a direct linkage can be forged.
Very briefly, I think the onus is primarily on the MDBs and the manner in which they create financing and provide financing. But I also think that the large regional economies in different geographies have it incumbent upon them to make their lines of credit, existing lines of credit for regional development, veer towards green transitions, and use those lines of credit to provide some kind of finance for green transitions in their own region.
Thank you. So just to reply to the question from our friend from Romania, yeah, right? Yes, so I believe if you're asking what are other developing nations doing, for instance SIDS, for instance Mauritius, we also have a clear vision and a clear strategy to reduce our greenhouse emissions, and also a 2030 agenda aligned with the United Nations goals. So for instance, we have in the government budget a lot of initiatives. For instance, we have banned plastic usage. We have also right now signed what you called a unified biodiversity alignment framework, I think it's called, with the United Nations. So this is to protect our marine life. Maybe Mauritius is surrounded by the ocean, and so marine life is crucial to us. And about the climate financing, which I said earlier, Mauritius, as a small island developing state, is raising funds and also generating awareness. As I said earlier, it starts from education, both formal and informal education. So from the kids being aware about it, to the media also helping to generate that kind of awareness so that people don't continue polluting. It's a simple thing. If you don't clean your own yard, and at the end of the day, and you wait for others to come and clean it, it will always be messy. But if you start by your own yard, definitely that's the starting point. That's why I say capacity building and education is key. And I still believe, though, that the commitment which developed nations took earlier, so be it the Kyoto, Doha, COP, all these international agreements. So if the developed nations didn't have to take a commitment to this climate financing, then I don't understand why they should still be at the table. I'm sorry, but I'm very blunt. So if they have failed to deliver the promises made 14 years ago, and we're still talking. That's why I said earlier, I'm sorry, but no more lip service. So we are at COP28, so I believe we all have that commitment and that will, so let us all join hands. Thank you.
Renata, do you want to make any?
Maybe in the context of climate finance, our government have conducted budget taking. So, but only at the central government, it is around every year, I think in the round of 70 trillion to 100 trillion rupiah. But fortunately, it's only 1/3 of fossil fuel subsidies. Thank you.
Just to stress, the debates about energy transition are very much focused on domestic policies. But we are witnessing right now a number of disguised protectionist measures that distort market prices and competitive advantage. And this is a dimension that must be included in the agenda with regard to energy transition as well.
Thank you all very much. I think a round of applause to everybody, from everybody. Just to sign off with a couple of remarks, because I see our guest of honor is also here. I think the first thing is really time. When we're talking about developing economies and transitions, the time is the factor. It cannot be overnight, and it can certainly not be in 5 or 6 or 7 years. The modalities are not in place to be able to affect such a change so rapidly. The second one, of course, is the cost of capital for developing economies. It's both about private capital, but also how much it costs. It costs much more for us to borrow on the market than it does other countries. And so the important role of multilateral development banks. There are a number of proposals on the table there that require certainly political will and commitment, but these are really good options, including what we do with special drawing rights. I think the next point is really the issue around negative spillovers. I mean, and that, and trade protection, green protectionism, or what becomes green protectionism, I think, which is also related to time. And the last point I want to make is that I think we have seen, certainly in the African context, a rising agency about what we want to put onto the agenda. And I think this is the same with many developing economies. And I think there is one lesson that we can take from Prime Minister Mia Mottley in Barbados about the role that small countries, small island developing states, but also any small country can make in terms of shifting the narrative. And so from a global South perspective, there is also significant ways in which we can build coalitions to amplify our voices and to put to really push agendas forward. And lastly, I think it's a message to the developed world. There are lots of commitments that have been made over many years. At the same time, the global South recognizes, I think, the importance of the green transition. But we can't be expected to come to the table with all of those commitments we have made in our NDCs, etc., without actually also the kind of support that is necessary in terms of those who have committed some of the most significant contributions to carbon emissions stock. We can't do the one without the other, not when the cost of capital debt issues are so high for developing economies because of the global superstructure. It's not always because of policies we have ourselves applied. These are externalities. So let me leave it there. I hope it's a fairly upbeat note. And thank you all again, and hand over to Promit.